Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Dwarfbridge. In the year 100 of the Common Reckoning, Godric, the king of the Skeldings, marched on Dwarfbridge. His intention was to destroy that settlement, and thus secure all of the land to the southwest of the Tumblewater for the Skeldings. Godric's army consisted of 100 of the king's spearmen, veteran warriors in mail coats, bearing great shields. There was also a well-armoured force of 150 cavalry, led by Aldric, the Warden of Overwater. The rest of the army was composed of unarmoured levy troops. There were 150 men armed with spear and shield, 150 light infantry with shields and javelins, and 150 archers. The small dwarvish town of Dwarfbridge was so named because it stood by the bridge spanning the Tumblewater that the dwarf Hastine had built some 40 years previously. Many of the inhabitants of Dwarfbridge had anticipated Godric's coming and had fled, but a number of dwarves remained, determined to defend their homes. Their leader was Swanlaug, the widow of Orm. At Dwarfbridge, the river Tumblewater ran in a southerly direction. On the eastern bank, set some significant distance back from the water, were the rich farmlands of the halflings. At the western end of the bridge, at the junction of two ways, the dwarves had built their toll house. Those that crossed the bridge, paid their toll, and turned left, would find themselves on the road to Overwater. The right-hand fork was the track to Dwarfbridge, which sat on higher ground, set back from the river. The track ran through walled fields, and more such fields surrounded the town. The forces at Swanlaug's disposal were varied. In front of the toll house, on the road to Overwater, she placed 100 armoured dwarves from the Geitsmark. Many of these dwarves had previously fought alongside Orm at the Battle of Bleakbrook. Some of them had crossbows, and the remainder had spear and shield. On the bridge itself, Swanlaug placed several dwarves carrying large hammers. These dwarves were not expected to fight. As was their wont, the dwarves had built the bridge well and strong, but before the battle they had prepared the bridge so that, with some effort, the keystones could be hammered out of position. If Dwarfbridge fell, so would the bridge that the dwarves had built. Svanlaug had sworn that no Skelding would ever cross it. Svanlaug had appealed to the halflings for aid, pointing out that if the dwarves were defeated and the Skeldings crossed the Tumblewater, things would not go well for the halflings. But relations between the dwarves and the halflings had soured as late, and in the main these appeals fell on deaf ears. Only around 100 halflings, armed with bows, responded to Svanlaug's call, and she placed these archers behind the walls lining the track to the town. Further along that track, Svanlaug placed those that remained of the fighting dwarves of Dwarfbridge. There were around 100 of these dwarves, all armoured. As with the dwarves from the Geitsmark, some of these dwarves had crossbows, while others carried spear and shield. The largest component of Svanlaug's force was her shieldwives. Many of the women of Dwarfbridge had volunteered to fight to defend their homes, and some 300 of these had been trained in hand-to-hand combat over the winter. These women wielded various hand weapons, all of them held shields, and most of them also had mail coats. Svanlaug positioned them in the fields in front of the town under her personal command. Godric ordered his archers and light infantry to advance in the centre, toward the dwarves and halflings on the track. the men moved forward in a block, with the archers in front and the javelineers behind. Observing this, the dwarves of the Geizmark loosed a cloud of crossbow bolts into the flank of the advancing mass of Skeldings. Many men fell, and others scattered. The Skelding advance stalled, the men disordered into a chaotic mess. Godric was unperturbed by this setback. After all, levied light infantry are not renowned for their steadiness, and a certain level of skittishness when being shot at was to be expected. While the Skelding captains in the centre attempted to restore order, Godric ordered his levy spearmen to advance on his left flank, towards Dwarfbridge itself. He followed behind with the king's spearmen to provide support if needed. And on Godric's right flank trumpets blared, and Aldric and the cavalry charged down the overwater road, thundering toward the dwarves of the Geizmark. If this cavalry charge was intended to distract the dwarves of the Geizmark from peppering the Skelding light infantry with crossbow bolts, it did not succeed. While the screening spear dwarves levelled their spears at the onrushing cavalry, another volley of dwarvish crossbow bolts whistled toward the cowering Skeldings in the centre of the battlefield, causing yet more casualties, cowering, and confusion. The entire Skelding centre retreated in disarray. On the Skelding left, the levy spearmen had reached the field walls surrounding the town. The diminutive dwarvish shieldwives, barely taller than halflings, quailed when faced with the serried Skelding spears. But although the shieldwives stepped back, they did not run. On the Skelding right, the dwarves of the Geizmark also stepped back, retreating down the road toward the bridge, forming a line in front of the toll house, bracing themselves for the impact of the Skelding horsemen. The cavalry crashed into the dwarves. Although the dwarves initially held their ground, the attention of the crossbow dwarves was distracted from the Skelding light infantry and archers, who reformed and again pressed forward. The Skelding levy spearmen clambered over the walls in front of them and advanced towards Svonlaug and her shieldwives, fully expecting that the dwarvish women would break and run. But they did not. Svonlaug gave a great cry, and the shieldwives echoed it and charged straight into the advancing spearmen, cutting many of them down. And now it was the turn of the halfling archers to get involved. As the reformed Skelding centre advanced toward them, the halflings loosed a storm of arrows at them. Yet more Skeldings fell, and once more the Skelding centre fell back in confusion. But on the Skeldings' right, their cavalry redoubled their assault on the dwarves of the Geizmark. Many dwarves fell, and others were thrown back. The dwarves were forced to withdraw, falling back onto the bridge, where they regrouped. Observing this, the halflings switched their attention from the Skelding centre and turned to face down the track leading to the bridge, anticipating that the Skelding cavalry would soon be coming their way. On the outskirts of the town, the shieldwives and the Skelding levy spearmen were still locked in hand-to-hand combat. But after their initial setback, the Skelding spearmen had steadied. As the Skeldings fought back, shieldwives started to fall. Seeing this, some of the surviving shieldwives fled, but the bulk of them withdrew in good order, facing off against their Skelding foes. Once more Svonlaug cried her war cry, and once more the shieldwives charged the Skelding spearmen, throwing them back in confusion. But despite dwarvish gallantry, still the Skeldings kept coming. In the centre, the Skelding light infantry rallied once again, and the surviving javelineers charged, toward the dwarves lining the track, and on the Skelding left, Godric and the king's spearmen now advanced into the fields of Dwarfbridge, coming to the aid of the shaken levy spearmen, and on the Skelding right, Aldric and his cavalry charged past the dwarves on the bridge and straight down the track leading to the town, straight toward the halfling archers, who stood in their path, patiently, valiantly awaiting them. The halflings loosed flights of arrows at the Skelding cavalry rushing toward them, and some of the horsemen fell from their saddles, but the impetus of the charge was unchecked. The king's spearmen had now closed with the remaining shieldwives, who, exhausted by their previous efforts, were starting to lose cohesion and fall back, and at this crucial stage of the battle the Skelding light infantry finally reached the track wall. The dwarves on the track were overwhelmed by a hail of javelins. Most of them were slaughtered, and the few survivors recoiled in disarray. And at that very moment the Skelding cavalry crashed into the halfling archers. The halflings had no chance. They were slaughtered where they stood. In the fields around the town, the struggle between Svonlaug and her shieldwives and Godric and his spearmen continued, but the tide of battle was turning toward the king's spearmen. Although the shieldwives still blocked the Skelding's path to the town, many had died thus defending their homes, and the fields that they had farmed ran red with their blood. Again and again the shieldwives charged, and again they fell back and formed into ranks facing their foes. But each time those ranks reformed, they were thinner. Now the Skelding light infantry pushed into the fields on the shieldwives' left, and Svonlaug realised that the battle was lost. She pulled her remaining shieldwives back into a less exposed position and formed them into a final shield wall, fully intending to die where she stood. Godric urged the king's spearmen forward for one last effort, and they charged into Svonlaug's shield wall. The dwarves of the Geitsmark retreated over the bridge, and the dwarves stationed atop the bridge wielded their hammers, and the central arch of the mighty bridge collapsed. That was the end of the bridge that Hastein built, and so Svonlaug's oath that no Skelding would ever cross it was fulfilled. As Svonlaug and her shieldwives desperately fought off the attacks of the king's spearmen, a shieldwife named Fastvi, who had previously run from the fight and hidden herself in a corner, gathered herself, and, ashamed of her previous cowardice, determined to die a heroine's death. Sword in hand, she charged directly at Godric. She did not reach him. Godric's spearmen converged on her child-sized figure, and she was impaled by many spears. But the diversion she caused enabled the remaining shieldwives to once more disengage, fall back and regroup, and, in this pause in the fighting, some of Svonlaug's closest followers spoke to her, imploring that the death of so many valiant dwarves should not be in vain, but that Svonlaug should retreat from the field, saving those of her people that she could. And the tears ran down Svonlaug's face, and she asked how she could save herself now that the day was lost, and it was clear that Fastvi and so many other brave dwarves and dwarf wives had given their lives for nothing in her cause. But her followers spoke to her of her daughter Sigrid, and said that not only was she Sigrid's mother, but the mother of all of the people of Dwarfbridge, and now that Dwarfbridge was lost, it was her duty to save what could be saved. And Svonlaug bowed her head and let them lead her from the field. And, to cover Svonlaug's retreat, the remaining shieldwives gave a great cry and charged one more time into the king's spearmen and scattered them. and even as the rest of the Skelding host moved up for the kill, the confusion that their charge caused enabled Svonlaug and her surviving subjects to flee into the hills. Thus ended the Battle of Dwarfbridge.